Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Layla Atassi, Metro columnist for The Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com. It's March 3rd and you're with a virtual City Club forum. A few days ago, the House passed the America Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion pandemic aid package. Among the items included in the bill are $30 billion in emergency rental assistance, and another $10 billion is earmarked for mortgage assistance. Money allocated in response to the staggering number of Americans still out of work and behind in their utility bills, rents, and mortgages. Many of these individuals and families were able to avoid eviction thanks to an eviction moratorium issued by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But uncertainty is starting to set in. The moratorium is set to expire at the end of March, and a federal judge in the Eastern District of Texas issued a ruling last week that declared the existing moratorium unconstitutional. So what does this all mean for struggling renters, homeowners, and landlords? Are we on the verge of another local or regional housing crisis? Today, we'll talk with local leaders about the state of evictions and the efforts underway to help both renters and landlords in urban and suburban areas of Northeast Ohio. As in every City Club forum, you can participate with your questions. Text them to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. You can also tweet them at the City Club. We'll try to work them in. Now for today's speakers. Joining us today are the Honorable J.J. Costello, Judge of the Cleveland Heights Municipal Court, Kevin Nowak, Executive Director of CHN Housing Partners, Hazel Remish, Supervising Attorney with the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, and the Honorable W. Monet Scott, Judge of the Cleveland Housing Court. I'd like to begin with Judges Scott and Costello, but panelists, please feel free to jump in at any point during the conversation. Judges, let's talk about the CDC's eviction moratorium and the impact that it's had on the sheer volume of cases that you're seeing. Has it resulted in a dramatic reduction in your caseload over years past? And do you suspect that the moratorium is the only reason for that, or are there other factors at play here?
Well, I can answer Judge Scott with Cleveland Municipal Court. So, of course, when dealing with the pandemic, we had a high volume of cases. So prior to the court closing down in the state of emergency, we had a little over 1,500 cases pending before Housing Court. And then when we closed down for the 90-day moratorium, and opened back up in around June 15th, we ended up by the end of the year with 2,958 cases. So there is a drastic decline, which is a good thing because we are in the throes of a pandemic, and these 90-day stay that the court put in place initially, along with the CDC moratorium, is getting people connected with rental assistance and allowing them to stay in their homes.
And then in Cleveland Heights, obviously, we don't have the same numbers that Cleveland does in terms of the volume of eviction cases. But I can say that at the beginning of the pandemic, for approximately 3 months, this court on its own initiative stayed all the evictions and continued them out. And so there was a backlog at that point that we got through once we began, and there was an additional delay. But once we had certain masks in place, plexiglass in place, and other conditions, we reopened. We also allowed for remote eviction hearings. So I do a combination of remote and in-person eviction hearings. There was a bit of a backlog when we began those up again that we were able to work through. But similar, we've seen a reduction in the number of cases, eviction cases that have been filed. I think it's down, when I was looking at the numbers, it's down roughly a quarter. About 25% over the last few years. So we also saw a reduction that presumably is because in part because of these CARES, first maybe the CARES Act and then the CDC moratorium as well.
So the moratorium is set to expire March 31st, and we've seen it extended a couple times. We know that when it does expire, it's been foretold that we'll see an avalanche of new eviction filings. How soon do you expect the end of the moratorium to give way to a potential housing crisis? What will it look like? What do you, as experts in the field, expect to see?
I'll jump in here. So Kevin Nowak, CH Housing Partners. I'm our executive director, and we're administering the rental assistance program across Cleveland, Cuyahoga County. A couple of key facts from that program. We've redeployed over $12 million worth of rental assistance. And when we look at the need keeps on coming. We've seen $220 million worth of income loss that people have identified through the program when they've come in. And we're seeing people still not getting back to work. Oftentimes, when we look at a crisis, so if we go back to 2008, 2009, you see kind of a drip in terms of job loss, as opposed to something that happened immediately. And then, because we have not, as a society, opened back up yet, and we still have, people that are out of jobs, we're seeing a lot of people who haven't applied for government assistance before. It's the first time that they're doing it, still out of jobs, and the ones who have applied. So when you think about the retail worker, when you think about someone in a restaurant, someone who's a home healthcare worker, a lot of these people had really great jobs before the pandemic, and still haven't recovered their full income that they had at this point in time.
Yeah, and Layla, I'll just add that this is Hazel with the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. One of the things that we've seen, so the CDC moratorium was initially supposed to expire in January. And in the month of January, we saw, or in the month of December, going into January, we saw an increase in eviction filings then. And we anticipate that was because people were thinking that the moratorium was not going to be extended. And so they were sort of getting their case in line. I would assume that there might, if the moratorium is not extended now, we'll probably see that going into April as well.
I wanted to ask about the, and Judge Costello, maybe this is a question for you. How does eviction look differently in the suburbs? I've heard it said, and Hazel, you've mentioned this to me in past discussions, that the financial crisis of this past year has led folks to experience housing insecurity who never had to deal with it before. And I'm wondering, once the moratorium ends, do you expect to see a different demographic facing eviction than has historically been the case?
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. It seems to me that the people that are coming before me, nearly everyone is there because, maybe not directly because of the pandemic, but at least in some small or large part as a result. And in Cleveland Heights, the type of housing that we have here is certainly different in Cleveland and even in surrounding suburbs. We do not have the large apartment complexes, large landlords, as some other places do. By and large, the housing here in Cleveland Heights, the rental housing here in Cleveland Heights, is smaller apartment units and primarily single and double homes. But I, from what I have seen that comes before me, certainly it's affected across the board, all kinds of people. That a number of people that I've seen have indicated to me that they had solid, well-paying jobs and suddenly were before me and certainly didn't expect to be.
Kevin, if we could talk a little bit about more about rental and utility assistance. What money is still available? What will soon become available? And how far does that reach to address the level of need in the region?
Sure. When we're looking at the money that's available, we still have some, the money that we have available today is federal money. So there was some money that the city of Cleveland and Cuyahoga County had set aside during the summer last year that we haven't fully deployed yet. We anticipate deploying that, through spring. We also have additional money coming from both the city and the county. The city has already allocated additional $10 million, of rental assistance, from federal money that's come in from when you hear about the bill that was passed back in December at the federal level. There was certain dollars that the city of Cleveland and Cuyahoga County were received as part of that. So the city of Cleveland has set aside money from that, and Cuyahoga County is also setting money aside from that, and is still determining what the amount of rental assistance they'll be providing will be available. So at this point, we're accepting applications. We're still deploying rental assistance, and then we'll have an additional tranche of money that will be coming in here in March and April to help further support the need. The need, like I mentioned earlier, is extreme. When we look at people that are continuing to apply, we're in the over 10,000 that have applied to rental assistance over time. We're still seeing applications coming in at about 1,000 applications a month. We're seeing people when they're coming in, oftentimes they're coming in owing continually more. So early in the crisis, people were just a couple of months behind. People who are applying now are several months behind. And some of the most recent federal legislation, and as the city and the county have contemplated in deploying the dollars, will be more permissive to really cover up to 12 months of rent that has not been paid.
Mm-hmm. That was going to be one of my next questions is what's happening to renters during this moratorium? Are they falling further and further behind in rent each month, or is the rental assistance adequately preventing that? I've wondered this so many times. How many recipients of rental assistance will eventually end up in eviction anyway? What's your sense?
So, when we deploy our rental assistance, the first thing that we want to do is to make sure that it is addressing the need in arrears. So, if someone owes 3, 4, 5, 6, now potentially up to 12 months in arrears, we want to make sure that's covered. And when a landlord accepts those dollars, they are acknowledging that they will not evict someone for the rent that otherwise we had paid from the past. In the current legislation from federal government, it allows for us to be able to forward deploy rent as well. So if someone were income eligible, they would be able to get up to 3 months of additional rent, forward looking, which helps to address some of that need. In terms of the overall need within the population, again, we aren't seeing still that kind of extreme pickup, in employment. So that automatically translates to this continuing need that we're seeing of about 1,000 households applying a month for rental assistance, and we see that likely happening through the summer.
Meeting that need forward looking, is that a new feature of the rental assistance program, or has that always been available?
It is a new feature with the federal assistance. So when we're looking at it, I think the federal government in a lot of ways was responsive to this continuing cycle that we're seeing. Like you had mentioned earlier, Leila, we're resolving the issue today, which is the arrearages. What about someone coming back into the system and needing additional dollars? So there were limited dollars before that were a little bit harder to deploy than what we have now. That were part of the ecosystem of rental assistance. But now with these new federal money that's coming in, it will allow for us to more flexibly deploy, rent going forward.
Is there any limitation to someone applying for assistance who has received it at some other point in the past year?
We can't have duplication of assistance, so we would not be able to double pay for what someone's already had assistance before, and we'll need to be contemplating what the number of months that otherwise would be permissible, and kind of concurrently, in terms of when that's deployed. Thank
you. So just to shift gears for a moment, one of the most progressive policy undertakings of the past couple of years is Cleveland's right-to-counsel initiative, in my view, guaranteeing free legal representation for families living in poverty and facing eviction in the city. The program officially launched this past summer, right in the heart of the pandemic, not a minute too soon. Hazel, you've been just the champion of this initiative. We've already seen some promising data from the program's first months. Can you tell us a little bit about how right-to-counsel is changing outcomes for families in housing court?
Absolutely. So as a legal aid advocate, I've always understood how important it is for tenants who are facing eviction to have an attorney represent them, and how their outcomes can really change when that representation is part of the bigger puzzle. What we've seen over the course of the last 6 months, so right-to-counsel became effective July 1st, 2020. So in the first 6 months, we were able to assist about 323 households. The eligibility requirements right now are that a household has to be at 100% of the federal poverty guidelines and have a child in the household. So in that composition, we've seen about 323 households in the first 6 months and about 700 children that were impacted by right to counsel. And in collaboration with CHN Housing Partners and also some of the other organizations that are handling rental systems like Eden, we've been able to really successfully execute on what the outcomes look like. So for example, in the first 6 months, 93% of legal aid clients under the right to counsel program were able to avoid eviction or involuntary displacement. So that means that those households were, they either stayed in their homes because of our work and our work in partnership with CHN, or they were able to transition to other housing that meant that they were stable as they were moving on. So we've seen a tremendous success already and an impact. We knew it was important, but I think the pandemic has highlighted what a critical intervention this is when we're talking about stabilizing children, neighborhoods, improving housing conditions, and employment opportunities for this population.
Mm. And there are challenges too, right, Hazel? Making sure families know about this important resource and choose to show up to their hearings. Tell us about the difficulty in the outreach effort and how legal aid has tried to solve around those problems.
Yeah, so it is a challenge. Generally, prior to the pandemic, prior to right to counsel, about 60% of people facing eviction were not showing up to their hearing at all. And so we knew that was going to be a challenge altogether. It varies as to why people don't show up. The stress and the trauma of an eviction, having to go down to the Justice Center, instead of focusing on the legal case, they might focus on, I just have to move. A lot of people don't understand that you don't have to move until there's a court judgment that says you have to move. And so these challenges existed prior to right to counsel and prior to the pandemic. What we've seen is that so in terms of our outreach, every single summons that goes out, so every person who's being served with eviction papers is getting an insert that tells them, you may be entitled to an attorney, you should contact legal aid. And in addition to that, they're getting a personalized letter that tells them they might be eligible as well. We've done radio spots, social media, billboards, all kinds of outreach so that people know that this resource is out there. But even then, and I think maybe Judge Scott can speak to this, is a lot of tenants are still not showing up or not calling us ahead of their hearing. And so in order to bridge that gap, we have staff available on every single court docket that is available to see if people are eligible and to screen them. And then the court has been granting a 1-week continuous for us to be able to represent them. So there is still a large population of folks who are facing eviction that are not reaching out to us. And we've been really working on encouraging people to know that this resource is available and that we can represent and we can help.
Mm-hmm. And the digital divide creates issues too, which are exacerbated greatly during the pandemic when virtual hearings are a necessity. Judge Scott and Hazel, you've both been working on some pretty innovative strategies on that front. Could you fill us in?
Yeah, so I mean, I can talk about it from the tenant perspective. Initially when the pandemic hit, one of the things that we saw was, I can talk about it. I don't know if everybody heard me. It just told me I unmuted. But from a tenant perspective, one of the things that we've been doing at Legal Aid is we've noticed that there is a digital divide, that tenants have a hard time either coming down to our offices because they have children that are in school remotely, or just generally have a hard time coming down, or they're sick, or there are other barriers that prevent them from having access to their hearing, which is being done virtually. So one of the things that we're doing at Legal Aid is we're actually having loaner tablets. We're going to launch this sort of a little bit of a pilot program where we have tablets that are available, and we'll make sure that our clients have access to them. They can take them home, access their hearing from their home, and then return them to us. And it's just a pilot program at this stage, but really one way to bridge that gap. And we've been having discussions with the court as well about other potential initiatives.
Yes, thank you, Hazel. As working as the former fair housing administrator, I always knew that the digital divide existed. It still exists. It still dominates Cleveland's community. So in doing the virtual court rollout, one of the things that was in the forefront of my mind was to establish a place where the community could come and participate in their hearings. I firmly believe that everybody should have access to justice. And so we did that by establishing a Zoom kiosk in the court. The unfortunate thing is it still required people to come to court. But you were put in a sanitized room and you were able to attend your hearings, your eviction hearings and criminal case hearings remotely and virtually. What we're doing now is trying to be a little bit more innovative and getting it out into the community, but it's so many moving parts to have this done. So we have to make sure we have the best platform to use, also the best devices to use, and then scout out locations to put it. So right now we're partnering with a couple of individuals that's very important in the community that's dealing with the digital access. And so we hope to roll out in the next couple of months kiosks on different parts of the city of Cleveland in different buildings. We hope to partner in the future with Cleveland Public Library and also possibly the Cleveland Recreational Centers. So that is what the court is trying to do to make sure people will still stay connected and still have access.
Thank you. So in a few minutes, we'll turn to your questions to all our viewers. If you have any questions for any of our panelists, please text them to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. You can also tweet them at the City Club and we'll try to work them in. Let's see. Okay. Let's talk about policy and solutions, since I think we're running a little bit low on time. We want to get to some questions from the audience. The pandemic has really laid bare many of the weaknesses that we have as a society. One of them clearly is how insufficient our resources have been for stabilizing communities and improving housing security. To the panel, anyone who would like to field this, once this pandemic subsides, could we be approaching a moment in which there is a true appetite to change that? If so, how do we seize that moment? I've spoken in the past to some of you about, vouchers and long-term rental assistance. If any of you would like to field this one, feel free.
Sure, I'll jump in here. This is Kevin. A couple of things on that. One is in terms of delivery of services. So when we think about delivery of services, oftentimes we think about services people need to come into a building, right? On the courts is a different case, right? We need to, in terms of access and digital access. But as we've been delivering our services that are safety net services, such as utility assistance and rental assistance, we've needed to be conscious of and cognizant of and design programs that still can address the digital divide, but also we have been able to be more flexible for people. So when you think about a person who is low income, whether they just lost their job because of the pandemic or because in the long term they're in poverty, having someone take time off of work if they are working, having to bring their kids into an office to deliver services is in and of itself an issue, right? So what this has allowed for us to do is to begin to pilot that those sort of and beyond pilot, since we're now almost a year in, a different delivery system that provides more consumer choice for social safety net services. Second is this has allowed for us to think about engagement with landlords in a different way. Landlords are in the housing business. They aren't in an eviction business. And though we're focusing on eviction today, most landlords that we have worked with have wanted to find a way to make it work. So as a community that's delivering social safety net services, we have this real opportunity between what we're doing today and talking about today with rental assistance, but then also with the Let's Save Cleveland work to engage landlords. And finally, I would say, I hope for most of us in the community, this experience with the pandemic has shown us the need and for us as a community to become more self-reliant, right? In terms of the pandemic response, it's something that we've needed to address and really need to take control of at the local level. Also, even though we've been able to receive federal money, it's been that local deployment, which is what gets it out. So my hope is, what we're seeing here is an ongoing need, unfortunately, for rental assistance, utility assistance, and that we'll begin thinking big locally about ways to fund that, at the city and the county level, to help to create more sustainability in housing within our community.
And just to follow up on Kevin's point, I would concur with what he was saying in terms of landlords having an interest and not being in the business of evictions. And that's absolutely true. And it's been my experience, both in my practice before taking the bench and now taking the bench. I have a focus in my court and push as best I can for the parties to settle. And I have found, even before the pandemic and certainly now as well, that both parties, if they're given the opportunity to discuss it, either a pay-to-stay agreement or an agreed move-out date, whatever the agreement may be, knowing that the court then will enforce that, gives both landlords and the tenants the assurance to enter into those agreements. And I found it to be largely successful and avoided a great number of evictions as a result. Just as an example, I had an eviction docket this morning, and I was curious to see how many, and almost 80% of the cases that I heard today ended up settling. And of those that didn't, the only reason that they didn't is because the tenant unfortunately didn't show up. And so I've found great use and great utility in those settlement processes. And certainly if there's funding available to assist tenants to bridge that gap and to make up the past payments and potentially even bridge the gap going forward for some time, I have no doubt that things like that would be hugely successful.
Since the topic of landlords has come up, we've actually been receiving a lot of questions. We'll turn to questions now. Many of them seem to be from landlords who have questions about the system sensitivity to their needs too. The first question is, what is the solution for landlords who need to pay their mortgages and bills? Without this income, the much needed availability of units will be reduced, contributing to the housing crisis. Any thoughts on that?
I can say in the housing court, we encourage mediation. And in doing so, I always try to educate the landlords in that rental assistance, and how you look at it is rental assistance is there to make the landlord whole. So if you have a tenant that's about $2,200 behind in rent and they haven't been employed since the onset of COVID, your interest is to encourage the tenants, and it can be done through housing courts mediation. We have one ADR specialist. We have one highly certified mediator, and we just trained our entire housing court specialists in getting Ohio Supreme Court certified for mediation. And so you want to encourage the tenants to participate in the rental assistance program, and that way it allows the landlords to receive funds that they would have received had the pandemic not happened.
Here's another question that actually takes it one step further and asks, should there be a tax break or greater assistance to rental property owners who have lost significant income due to the pandemic? Anyone from our policy, among our policy experts who'd like to field that one?
So Kevin here, I think a couple of quick things. One, CHN is also a landlord, right? So, we're not just administering the rental assistance program, but we're also a landlord. We own or manage about 2,200 units, across Northeast Ohio. And it's something that for us too, it's impacted our portfolio. As a landlord, we had really low delinquencies and defaults from our tenants, and we've seen that increase significantly, threefold plus, from the beginning of the pandemic to today, and it seems to have really kind of stabilized. And when I say stabilized, I mean really got consistently been now at this higher rate, and we're hoping that we'll be able to bring that down over time. Rental assistance has been the tool that has been most available, to landlords nationally. Are there ways that, the government, kind of local, state, federal could, may kind of apply greater relief through tax breaks. I think there are options there, under some circumstances. But to date, we've seen that rental assistance being the most effective tool, or at least the most utilized tool nationally.
And
This
Layla, I'll just
question,
add,
please go ahead.
I was just going to add that this is the one instance where both the landlord and the tenant have the same interest, which is, we want the rent paid. We want the landlord to get paid because that's how we're going to stabilize the housing. In terms of like a policy sort of angle and perspective, one of the things that we have really benefited from as part of the pandemic, I think, as a community, is sort of organizations coming together that we're working in similar space and saying, okay, well, what are you doing? What are you doing? And how can we collaborate to make it easier on this population that we're trying to serve? And that's, an example of that is right-to-counsel and sort of our relationship with United Way as a convener and as a partner, as we're getting the word out about right-to-counsel and services that are available, and 211 coming to the table as well. So I think one of the things that it has that we should be looking at as a policy issue is, what are the spaces that we're working on? What can we do together to make it better, and not operate sort of in a vacuum as we move forward as a community?
This question is probably directed to Kevin. The questioner asks, I'm wondering if Kevin and the judges could speak about the problems with extreme delays in processing applications for rental assistance. I work with people who apply for this help and they're waiting months to get this help, or are unable to get updates on their applications at all. How can CHN and other organizations improve their services to meet this need?
Sure. I think the first thing is, receiving that feedback is important, right? We're looking at, at a system, and a system that has had that much, as many applications into the system as we have. Hearing it firsthand, from landlords is really important. So I think first I want to say thank you for that question, because it's something that we, as we're thinking through kind of system development, is important. Second is, from CHN perspective, as we're entering now this March, we're increasing our staffing. We're going to be doubling our staff that's working on rental assistance, a little plus from that even, to ensure that as we see this kind of continued need, we're able to get the dollars out, more quickly. We did have, this was a system, particularly when we started, that was brand new for, as kind of a countywide system. So there's obvious hiccups from that. And then from there, it's really been us trying to work through, at least for our program, the sheer volume, and addressing addressing staffing need when we've been able to, and we are now.
I can say with housing court, and to those individuals that's assisting with tenants that are in search of rental assistance or in need of rental assistance, we don't want to encourage landlords to file an eviction in order to get the process move quicker through CHN. But if you've already submitted the application and the landlord has decided to proceed with an eviction, it is to your interest, and that's to the tenant's interest, to let CHN know that you have a pending case and give that case number. Those applications, if I'm not mistaken, they will automatically be escalated because you're right in the throes of being evicted. So that takes a little bit more precedence. So that's the only thing I can say with regards to housing court. It is up to the tenant to let CHN know once they filled out the application to, expedite those fees, those funds.
Another question. Have either of the judges sought guidance from the Ohio Supreme Court so that there's more uniformity among the many local municipal courts in handling cases where CDC declarations are filed? Judges, we discussed this the other day, that there's just very little guidance and too much left up to interpretation. How would you respond to that question?
I would say that's actually how sort of our system works, right? Is that the trial courts are making decisions. It then goes up to the appellate court and ultimately the Ohio Supreme Court or otherwise. It's how the system works. And it's not an ideal system. Certainly, if you're in different courts, they're all handling things different ways. I can certainly understand how that would be difficult for a landlord. But that's the system, and that it sort of goes up and then comes back down. On my end, and I've had conversations, and I know with Judge Scott and with other judges, municipal court judges in the area, especially early on. This was brand new to all of us, right? As with this pandemic, this was brand new. That CDC moratorium was brand new. No one had ever seen anything like it, and so there was a lot of communication between municipal court judges in terms of how each of us were going to handle it. And so while no one judge is going to tell another municipal court judge how they should do it, I think there was a lot of back and forth and some common ground that was found in terms of how we were going to handle those declarations. So I can say that happened. And I think that was helpful. Again, it's not going to be completely uniform. You've got different judges making different decisions, but I can say that there was absolutely that conversation early on, and it continues.
I have to agree to that. It's only 2 housing courts in the state of Ohio. And so myself and Judge Howe were in communication about how we would handle it. It was so much left up to interpretation. And I think a lot of people have to know that this CDC declaration form and the CDC moratorium is a proactive moratorium, that is not automatic, that the tenant must do certain things. They must first qualify, and then they must pay some type of rent. And our court, we are on the belief that people should still shelter in place until the end of this pandemic, which we hope is sometime soon. But also, either you need to be paying a portion and processing for rental assistance. And so it is not automatic, and we are allowing landlords to come back and contest it. If they have waited and tried to communicate with the tenants, we're starting to see those incidents where the tenant is not doing anything to advance their interest in paying their rent. So we revisit those cases, and I need for landlords to know that they do have that option to contest the CDC declaration form.
Hazel, from your perspective as an attorney, as an advocate, what are your observations or frustrations regarding that gray area? I know you've mentioned before the kind of questions around what qualifies as someone seeking government assistance and things like that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're seeing, and this is not a criticism on our partners who are processing rent assistance. This is in part the requirements of the funding is set up in a way that in order to access the funding, it's really quite burdensome for the tenant. There's a lot of documents that a tenant has to gather in order to be able to actually get the assistance. And what we've seen, especially with right-to-counsel, is that the role of the attorney has changed quite a bit. So as Judge Scott mentioned, the CDC declaration, the tenant has to raise it in order to invoke the protection. And so what we're seeing is that oftentimes tenants don't actually know how to navigate that process without an attorney by their side, sort of evaluating whether they're eligible and then subsequently helping them process that application. So it's all of the interventions that really coming together make a huge impact. But navigating it alone is challenging for tenants, and it relatively frustrating for landlords because of the same reasons we've been just talking about, right? Sort of the application process can take a long time. Tenants often don't know how to navigate it. It's been going on for so long. With regards to the interpretation of the CDC order itself, advocates have been left to argue, where does it apply? How should it be applied? And whether or not really what we should be looking at is, does that particular case, is it protected under the CDC order? Or if we decide that it's not protected, is it going to frustrate the intent of the order, which is for people to be able to shelter in place and not have to spread COVID-19. So it's been challenging, I think, all around as advocates, tenants, landlords, and the courts are having to process the cases and come out with rulings.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question for Kevin. What's the wait time for the rental assistance once you've applied?
Sure, that really varies in a couple of different ways. Some of it is depending upon how engaged the tenant is. Some of it is how engaged the landlord is, and then when we look at whether or not someone is in that eviction status. So, as Judge Scott mentioned earlier, about being able to expedite cases that are in eviction status. Legal aid has been one that has been an organization has been one of our kind of greatest referral partners, with that. So, that's something that can expedite and kind of address right away sometimes. But sometimes it will take, 30, 60, 90-day process with, between getting documentation together, from the tenant and the landlord, depending upon how engaged they are and what that volume may look like. But when we talk about eviction and a case that's in eviction, and if we're made aware of it, then it's something that we're able to expedite right away. And it takes, the tenant, making sure that the tenants understand that is something that we've been trying to do, and something that we'll continue to do, and appreciate the courts, both with Judge Scott and Judge Castillo, making sure to point that out.
Mm-hmm. There's someone has asked the question about the possibility of landlords accessing rental relief for tenants when tenants move out of the property while owing months of rent. Are landlords permitted to do that, or is that how does that work with the program?
Sure. The system's a tenant-based system. So, it's the tenant that would apply. You would need to income qualify the tenant. So each of the tenants need to be something that's called 80% of the area median income or less, which if you take a family of 4, that's about $60,000. If you take a single individual, that's about 42. So that we would need the tenant to initiate the application, and the tenant would need to kind of income verify, show that they're eligible based upon a COVID-related issue, which is through a self-attestation, and then the landlord themselves then would need to kind of confirm what was due. So the landlord would not be able to initiate that.
Mm-hmm. Question. We once had the Cleveland Tenants Organization. It no longer exists. How has its absence affected your work? To whomever would like to respond.
I mean, I can certainly talk to that a little bit. So one of the things that we've seen with right-to-counsel specifically is that in other jurisdictions who have implemented similar programs, it was really tenant-driven. So there was a lot of tenant organizing that drove that effort. We did not have that in Cleveland. And we sort of see it now, other organizations trying to step up. So for example, when CTO ceased operations, legal aid took over their tenant information line, and that's still ongoing. So we still provide that service. And recently there have been other organizations who have risen up to the challenge and are doing outreach, door knocking, and delivering materials to tenants that generally CTO would have done. So it's certainly still a void in our community. And I think some of the outreach that we're doing with United Way is facilitating some of that in the sense of empowering tenants and getting information out there. But certainly a void that still needs to be filled in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Hazel, how can we scale up right-to-counsel for tenants?
So right now, as I mentioned, it's a very limited criteria. Other jurisdictions have broader income limits or no income limits at all. As a community, we really need to think about what that might look like going forward. But certainly, it could be an expansion based on just eligibility and who does it apply to, based on income or the household composition, which are very limiting right now, and a very small pool of people that are really benefiting from the program.
How about a countywide expansion? I know this is a political issue, a political question, but
One can dream, right?
well played, Hazel. Here's another question. Once the eviction is filed, if it's resolved through the use of the federal funds, do those evictions remain on the tenant's record when filling out applications for future rentals? It's a great question.
In Cleveland Housing Court, if it's resolved and there's been an AJE, I've seen throughout all the AJEs that are coming through, that once the back rent is paid and they're current on their rent going forward, that the parties agree to allow a sealing of eviction. Now, sealing of eviction is something specific to Cleveland Housing Court, the city of Cleveland. We have had a lot of people come from different jurisdictions asking that their records be sealed, but our jurisdiction is very limited to Cleveland and Bracknell. So, and those are evictions that occurred in the city of Cleveland and the city of Bracknell. So we have kind of implemented that and encouraged that during the mediations. And that way it keeps everybody on task and allows people to, if they are willing to vacate. And I have to say, legal aid has been a good partner in encouraging a lot of that movement and mediation also, when you do have tenants that are represented through right-to-counsel. And so we tend to get on top of those sealing of eviction records so that people can relocate and find alternative housing.
And Leila, I think there's a misunderstanding in that just because there's an eviction that was filed doesn't necessarily mean that the person was evicted. And so a lot of times when landlords are doing a search and they see, oh, they had an eviction filed against them, well, they're not looking at what the outcome of that case was. And the outcome of the case could have been a dismissal. It could have been an agreement of some sort that didn't actually lead to a full-blown eviction. And so I think there's some misconception that a filing is automatically an eviction. So for those jurisdictions that don't have a motion, sealing process, one, it's discretionary, so it can still be done in those courts, even if there isn't a rule. But two, it doesn't automatically mean that the person was evicted and had a judgment against them.
Another question, how does CHN address the inherent conflict of interest between being a landlord and being the gatekeeper of rental assistance funds?
I think that's a good question. So something that we've done is, our portfolio is treated the exact same as everyone else's. And we've actually created a firewall between our property management team, who's run through a completely different part of our line of business, or part of our company, with the team that's running the rental assistance. So, we don't have any greater level of communication. We don't provide, kind of special treatment for the team. It's something where, we as organizations serve 40,000 families annually, throughout Northeast Ohio. I mentioned earlier, our portfolio of properties is about 2,200. So most of what we do, substantially all of what we do annually is delivering utility assistance, weatherization, other emergency assistance for families, housing counseling, and those parts of the company are run, by a different line than the one that is that reports up through property.
Okay. I'd like to return for a moment to the CDC's moratorium. The federal judge in Texas last week declared it unconstitutional. I'm pretty sure the Justice Department already has filed an appeal there. Do our panelists have any thoughts on how or whether that case will affect us?
So the decision itself is not binding on our local courts. And so from our perspective, the CDC moratorium is still in place, and we can still continue to utilize that as a tool to keep people housed.
Okay.
Just at this point, I just like to reiterate the importance of, and there are jurisdictional issues with this, right? For the courts, they can't just decide kind of what they want to do, for Judge Scott and Judge Costello, right? And there are within our system, our court system, within laws in the state of Ohio, there's only certain things that that local jurisdictions can do, right? But, you know, those are laws that can change, right? And I just want to go back to that point I made earlier about, you know, us really providing for that, you know, kind of local support and control is something that, you know, I think is important, because then it would allow for, you know, Judge Scott and Judge Costello, if that jurisdiction were provided, to implement, you know, that sort of moratorium. We relied too much on the federal government, you know, to address these very local issues.
Mhm. So we have just a few moments left. I want to just thank our panel, but also I'd like to give each of you a chance to provide your final thoughts on how we've weathered this pandemic as it relates to getting people through some of the toughest times and the worst of housing insecurity, and what lies ahead. If Judge Scott, would you like to begin kind of offering your final thoughts?
My final thought is that just participate in your hearing. If we can get more people to attend their eviction hearing, the first call, we can help you on the front end instead of scrambling to help you on the back end. We have legal aid sitting in on all the virtual hearings. We're doing those basic fundamental screening questions right off the top, if the 10 of the 10s, so that we know if they qualify or possibly qualify for right to counsel. And then it's just about our specialists connecting them with resources. If you're a veteran, if you qualify as a senior citizen, if you qualify as a single parent with minor children at home, there's resources there, but if you don't attend, you won't know about it. And then you're facing eviction, and then you're coming in to file those motions to stay. And it is just a more drawn out process, and that motion may get denied. So I have to say that never in the life of any of us has it been this much money granted to assist with rent. And so keep those lines of communications open so that the landlords talk to the tenants, and you're not worrying about, well, they've been evicted, so how can I get reimbursed? That's not what rental assistance is for during the pandemic, is to assist the tenants to stay in place. So I would encourage you to talk to your tenant while they're falling behind on rent, and get them connected with Cleveland Housing Network for rental assistance. So just participation all around and access and justice.
Those certainly, those are great points, Judge. I want to first just thank the City Club for putting this on. It's been great to be a part of this, and I think this is helpful in and of itself. And I guess what I try to focus on is the ways in which some of these changes that were forced upon us because of this pandemic might be useful as we hopefully end this and move forward. And so as an example, the fact that now in my court, there are both in-person and remote hearings for evictions, to me, that's something that I intend to probably keep on even after all this is going on. I think it makes both on the landlord side and the tenant side the ability to appear remotely, save them a trip to my courthouse, maybe less time that they have to take off work, childcare, etc. Those are the kinds of things that I think that we need to focus on. And some of the other things that have been discussed today in terms of bringing together different organizations, all these things are critical, that when we're finally through with this, that we continue on with those great ideas.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Hazel, would you like to offer a few final thoughts?
Yeah, I think, I agree with the judge, just to encourage folks to participate in the hearing process, to reach out to legal aid as quickly as possible. But in addition to that, I think as a community, we have to recognize that the pandemic has really highlighted how critical and basic of a need housing is, and how important that is, not just for the individuals, but for our neighborhoods and our schools and just the general success of our population. And so I really think that, we really need to begin to focus on that as a community, on stabilizing our housing and making sure that people have access to safe, decent, affordable housing, and making that a priority.
Thank you. Thank you. And Kevin, what are your thoughts as we wrap up our forum today?
Sure. I first like to again thank for being on here. This is just a incredible opportunity to be able to share this screen with close colleagues here who are trying to address these housing issues and appreciate all their work. When we're looking at this, I think the learnings that Judge Costello had mentioned, the kind of participation that Judge Scott had mentioned, and then Hazel really bringing it home with the need for safe, decent, affordable housing, and us needing as a community to prioritize that. Housing stability and homeownership opportunity for all is what we focus on at CHN. It's the power of permanent address. And so when we look at housing stability, there's never been a greater challenge to it than today because of that acute job loss, and we should learn from it and really prioritize it going forward.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I so appreciate the work you do. And thank you at home for joining us for today's forum on efforts to combat evictions and help both renters and landlords in urban and suburban areas of Northeast Ohio. We've been talking with the Honorable J.J. Costello, Judge of the Cleveland Heights Municipal Court, Kevin Nowak, Executive Director of CHN Housing Partners, Hazel Remish, Supervising Attorney with the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, and the Honorable W. Monet Scott, Judge of the Cleveland Housing Court. Today's forum is the Colleen Shaughnessy Memorial Forum. A St. Louis native, Colleen came to Cleveland in the 1980s as Sherrod Brown's campaign manager and eventually served as his deputy director. She was an enthusiastic, honest, and idealistic community builder. Her energy was contagious, and she demanded commitment and social awareness from all those in her life. We are grateful to her family, friends, and colleagues for honoring her with their endowment gift in support of City Club programming. All City Club's virtual forums are presented for free every week, thanks to generous support from Bank of America, Key Bank, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and PNC. You can join them in supporting City Club's mission by making a contribution online or becoming a member at cityclub.org. I'm Layla Atassi. Thanks for joining us today. Our forum is now adjourned.